So, I mean, the thing I should say too is that I think it's quite clear that Jing and I have very different approaches. And I think even when we're talking about area or even local, we probably mean very different things. So it is what it is.
Obviously, this is not rehearsed. The following is actually one of the things I find interesting, if I can impose this or project this onto Dina, is that we're both working with questions, not so much there's a constant, we're looking at variations, but that we're looking at when does a particular scale, or particular like local or global or regional or urban or national become important? Like why do people, when do we tend to concentrate and flock to the local or national as that one rubric we're going to put our political force behind? And I think that in itself is very interesting, opens itself up to lots of historicization. But one thing that I would ask Dina, and this is really for my own purpose, I'm just wondering what you think about this, is that how do we make these different scales move together, right? So we're not just doing this very inflexible gear shifting between local, global, but how do we string them together, look at points of contiguity, or in some way, this is actually a question about a larger method of moving from, let's say, the empirical work of area studies to a more theoretical work that has a more universal import for people in different disciplines. So the question is really, how do we do that? Can we think more flexibly? Right. I mean, obviously, when we look at the local and the global, the first thing one would say is, well, you know, the two are quite porous and one constitutes the other or cannot exist without the other. And that's all fine and good. But I'm wondering if we could just sort of proceed to depart using that as a parting point and try to think about, okay, and now what? We understand these scales move, they're flexible, they're relative. It's like, what do we do with this relativity? I mean, do we have a kind of critical vocabulary, right, to actually put that into practice as opposed to, you know, presenting a disclaimer in the preface to our books and then go on and do sort of very old school style scholarship anyway.
Right. I think that's the big challenge, and it sounds like it's probably the big challenge in area studies as well. And I mean, you know, perhaps it was my lame attempt at the end to think about mixed methods, because I think mixed methods starts to get at linking these different levels together. But it's difficult because on the one hand, as scholars, you know, we need to specialize. We need to create a niche. And I think doing too many things, such as mixed methods, and I think this is why it's difficult, in some ways it's not practical, right? And it's more practical for us to kind of become trained in a particular area with a particular method and maybe utilize the work from other people and put it together for a larger explanation. But I think for a lot of us, that's really unsatisfying, or at least for me lately. It's been unsatisfying to simply be in my own, even though it's very safe, it feels good, it's safe to be in that niche, but I think to answer the questions that I'm interested in, I'm really unable to think about, you know, just use one method, one type of analysis to get at these broader questions. And I guess you could still use the same sort of method, but look at different sorts of cases. That's another way to get at larger explanation. But I think I'm digressing a little bit from your larger question. So how do we think about scale and make them work together? Yeah, it's an open question. I mean, I hate to turn it back to you and ask you the same question, but I mean, I think what I wasn't sure is whether you were advocating for that in terms of area studies and how it should move forward.
You mean to be safer or to be?
No, so were you advocating that area studies should think about, that they haven't thought about these different scales and they need to think about it to move forward or not? I wasn't clear. So.
Well, I think actually what I would say about area studies is not that, you know, it fell short and it was kind of came out to be sort of a country cousin to all of the disciplines, but that we didn't go far enough. I mean, because in some ways, if you look at the original conception behind area studies, that is SSRC pamphlets in late 1940s, language was actually not the critical part. In fact, it was first modeled, right? And here's a surprise. So Greek and Roman studies were the original areas. So, right, so that was actually considered precursor of area studies, which would include studies in the history, the philosophy, the fine arts, the geography, the politics, and other aspects of the classical world, in addition, of course, to the basic offerings in language and literature. Now, it was a gross inadequacy on the part of execution that we end up being stuck on language, because it turns out, oh, that's actually key to everything else. But then this becomes the ultimate identity of area studies, which is completely, it was a real, I think, a very unfortunate compromise. And this is visible in the important act that was passed, the National Defense Education Act in 1958, which provided all these funding for language studies and founding of area study centers at major universities. To this day, the National Security Education Program, which is basically taken over the same function, and it was actually born out of the aftermath of Operation Desert Storm. So to this day, we still tend to think of area study as people who teach languages. Now, there's several problems with that, apart from the obvious, that no, we're not just language teachers, because it actually protects this kind of nativist advantage, which I think is actually particularly problematic when we think about area studies, right? That there are those who, by virtue of having command over native language, being a native speaker, gives them some kind of a naturally endowed capacity to explain China, Japan, or Korea, or Vietnam to other people. And has also provided pockets, I think, of protectionism, in the sense that one used to be able to make a career out of translating, maybe you still can, an author, right? You can write a whole study on just translating, an author that everybody else in Japan knows about. And that to me is kind of a very odd, I wish we were still in that very lucrative phase of academia. And it also gives, people complain, or people are worried that if you're a non-native speaker, if you're not Chinese, your Chinese is never going to be better than the ones who are Chinese, so on and so forth. And this creates lots of very, I think, undesirable consequences for precisely thinking about area studies as a kind of mom and pop store. So I think now one of the major things I think where area studies should go to is precisely by opening up all these very uncomfortable sore spots and wounds and things like that, and to basically make it very transparent. And this means to sort of parse out what it means to be standard languages or dialects, but also what does it mean to be a native speaker of anything, really. And this will include when do we profess our allegiance to a national language or local dialect or regional speak, and what does it mean for intellectuals to write about, people who cannot speak, like coolie laborers or peasants, or, peasants, proletariats, farmers, and these are the backbone of modern Chinese history. But it is, I think, that's still the least understood, right? And that's where it goes right down why I name urban as also one of the skills that we should mobilize because of current day, the massive internal migration that's flocking to urban areas.